to Bauer's House Podcast, Episode 9. And my guest today is an actress and singer who has appeared in shows like CSI Miami and Monsters. And you may also recognize her voice from games like Warcraft 2 and 3. Please welcome Rebecca Downs. Rebecca, thank you so much for being here today.
Hi, thank you. This is fun. I'm glad I'm here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, glad to have you here today. And it's funny, Rebecca, because I recently became aware that you did voice work for a couple of video games that I grew up playing as a kid. And that is Warcraft 2 and 3. And these were roles that you did quite some time ago, I would say.
Yes.
Um, and I was wondering, how did you end up getting those voice roles?
It's so funny. Um, my agent called me and sent me out for this. And actually, I remember, and the casting director I had met already also. So it was just one of those flukes where they just said, "Hey, we're going to send you out for this thing. Go ahead and read for it." And I wasn't really a video game person. So whatever, it was fun and I liked it. So I read for it. And then about a couple of hours after my audition, I got a call from the casting director and asked me. I think it was just a couple of hours, maybe it was the next day. It's been many years, as you pointed out. But he said, "Hey, did you by any chance upload those sides, those that script online? Because somebody named Rebecca did that." And of course, when you audition for these things, you sign all of these non-disclosures. You're not supposed to tell anybody. It's a huge secret.
Right.
So I was bewildered because, as I said, I wasn't a video game person. I'd be like, why would I do that? You know, like what possible reason? So anyway, I said no. And I remember hanging up thinking, well, I am not getting that job because they're not even going to risk. And for some reason, I did. And so I ended up doing the first and then the second. And then I did something, and I had no idea what it was, something called an expander version as well. That
Yeah.
was a big secret too, by the way. I had a friend who played Warcraft and he was like, "Come on, tell me what's coming out, what's coming out." I'm like, "I can't even tell you what kind of a thing it is."
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, because just because you're providing voice work doesn't necessarily mean they're letting you in on all the details
No,
of the project.
no, you are the voiceover actor. And in fact, what's really interesting is that this kind of work you do in pieces. So for example, if you're doing a film or a TV show or even voiceover for a commercial or something, usually you see the whole project and they want you to see the whole project because it gives you context and
Right.
you do a better job. In this situation, and they gave me a script and it was just a series of lines. I wasn't given any lead in lines like this is what the person says to you and then you say it. No, it was just this is the script and just gave me all of these lines and then they would ask me to do them three or four different ways. So I would do a spell. And then the script, as you know, has alternatives depending on the outcome of the character. So you
Right.
say the spell this way with this ending, or you say it this way with this ending. And so you just give them all of the iterations that they want. And
Right.
then at the end of the session, they say, "Okay, now we're going to do the screams." And
Oh my
so,
gosh.
okay, now scream like you're being poleaxed. Okay, now scream like you're being stabbed, but slowly. Now scream like you're falling off a cliff. And so I would do all of these weird screams at the end of the session.
That's so funny.
That's how
And
you do them.
it's because the way that that game works is like you're this like unit that you can be controlled by the player. So every time they're picking where you move, you're saying a line, and a lot of the times it's repeated. So when I would play this game when I was younger, I would just have your voice constantly repeating in my head. There's still lines that I still remember to this day where it's like, the flows of magic are whimsical today.
The flows of magic are whimsical today.
And
Yes.
and it
Yes.
was in this sort of almost like seductive sounding voice. So what
Mhm.
I was wondering is like, did they give you any sort of direction as to how you were going to do the lines, or?
Yeah, they would. Again, because there was so little context. It was actually really, it was this, I remember the first time it was this big bearded guy, and he was sitting in the other part of the studio outside of the booth. And he would listen to me to do it, and I'd see him consider it. And then he would make a suggestion, like make it a little more suggestive, make it a little bit more, make it smoother, make it more mysterious,
Yeah.
make it more biting. And so we would just make these little corrections. And I never knew which version they used or if they used all of them. And to me, it was like I was just generating raw material. And
Yeah.
then the gamers and the programmers and such, they would put it all together. It was kind of a
Amazing.
fascinating way to work.
Yeah, yeah. Voice acting to me is fascinating. I feel like a lot of people don't really have that insight into what it takes
Hmm.
sometimes. Like, I've heard that voice actors can feel fatigue after even just one session because you're stressing your voice in certain ways. And I think a lot of people tend to think like, oh, it's easy. You just go in the booth and you record a couple things and you're done, you
Yeah.
know? But I
Oh,
feel like
were the
there's so much
job
more
that
to
easy?
it.
Well, the best part about it is, yeah, you can show up in your pajamas if you want to. So that's the easy part. But it's true, when you don't have your face conveying it, you have to put all of that energy into the voice.
Right.
And it has to be real. It's easy to sound fake. You have to be really, really focused on what you're doing, and you have to provide whatever context you can. If you don't have context, you have to figure it out. You have to just make it in your head. And
Hmm.
so someone will say to you, make it more seductive. And so then you have to picture who you are and picture who you're talking to and figure out, this something I want from them. And so now I'm going to make them want to give it to me. And so you do these things in your head. So it's a lot of energy, and it's
And
fun and it's interesting and creative. Go ahead.
oh, absolutely. And it's funny because on your IMDb page, it has you credited as the sorceress for Warcraft 3. But then
Mm-hmm.
also for the Warcraft prior to that, it says that you did various roles.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so apart from the sorceress, were there any sort of like more rangy type of characters, like something like complete opposite to that you had to do voices for?
I'm trying to remember. Um, I remember having to, like, really trying to change my voice, kind of making it a little bit, because whatever I was doing, I just didn't want it to be like the sorceress, which is really, that's my wheelhouse. That kind of a role, that kind of
Yeah.
a role where you're sort of going, come here, let me help you while I stab you in the back. That kind of
Right.
so much fun. And so anything that was far away from, so I would try to make my voice very crackly. And I'm trying to remember, because here's the real secret. I never ever played Warcraft, and I never knew what it was. And I think it was the second or third one I did for them. I somehow let that slip. And I remember seeing that guy's face, and he was like, "What?" And he's like, "Come here." And he took me back into the inner workings of Blizzard, where there were all of these people working at these big, everybody was at a desk and they were showing me on the big screens. They were working on different pieces of it, and it was incredibly elaborate. And I just remember being immensely colorful because every screen had a different scene on it and a different piece of a scene, a castle or a beautiful glade or a forest or something. And they just showed me all of these things that they were doing. But I'd never played it, so I didn't know who the characters were. And so I was just making stuff up, which was fun. And I know that a lot of times when I've done other voiceover, I did a Spider-Man, for instance. And
Right.
so what they'll do is they'll set the camera up to watch your face while you're making the character. And then they actually take some kind of inspiration from that. I don't know whether they use the live action to sort of inform how they're going to make the face work, but I believe
Mhm.
that's what they do. And so I think that what they were doing partly was creating the character a little bit. They were sort of, okay, now with this voice, we're going to make the character look like this. I never knew which happened first, whether it was they're saying, I want him to sound like this, I want him to be really young or her or whatever. I wanted to be an angry character. I never knew whether how much of the character they'd already created and how much they were using the voice that came out as a result of the things they said to help finish the job.
That's got to be tough because I know there's got to be certain voice roles where they do let you in on a lot of that, like where they do provide references
Oh,
as to
yes.
how they look or how they appear. But
Mm-hmm.
then other times, like you're saying, maybe it's so early in the development process that they just say, just give us the voice, and then they figure the rest out later.
There were times when they were so specific, not just with World of Warcraft. I'm actually trying to remember, and this is terrible. I can't remember my own my own resume, but there was a video game where I was this thing called the Tome of Power, and I was guiding the main character on his quest. And they were so specific. They knew absolutely what they wanted.
Oh,
And
wow.
so that was a very different way because they were, I would say it a certain way, or I'd find something and they'd say, no, we need you to be more commanding now. You are actually this character who was a prince doing a quest looks up to you. You are their guide. You are a shining light. They would describe to me what the tome of power was. And so yeah, then it's just different. I don't know if it's harder. It's just different.
I was just about to ask too, like, would you feel more comfortable in that role doing that where they're giving you like more insight and more guidance into it? Or is it not really much of a difference, like, compared to like what
Well,
you
when
did
they're
with the
giving you
sorceress?
guidance, you have a measurement. So you can definitely, let me see how, when they're giving you guidance, on the one hand, you could worry that you're not giving them what they want.
Right.
On the other hand, it's so specific that you really can find it gives you a lot of impetus and a lot of it allows you to find it. When they're just kind of saying, here's 5 ways you're going to say the line. And okay, say it a little bit more this way. It feels more mechanical, but as I say, you're making stuff up and that's kind of fun. I just,
Yeah,
I love voiceover work because voiceover work is so filled with imagination.
it is. Yeah.
One of the jobs I did way earlier, before I moved to Los Angeles, was I would loop movies. I belonged to a loop group. And so we would be this group of actors who would be in the studio and they might have us either I would revoice an actor in a movie for whatever reason. Either if there was one movie I revoiced where the actress's French accent was too strong and they just couldn't understand her, so they had me revoice her entire character.
Oh,
I
wow.
I think a famous instance of that, I think, was when Glenn Close revoiced an actress's voice in a Tarzan, I think it was, because they weren't happy with the outcome of the actress, and so they had Glenn Close redo it. So they liked the actress and she was marvelous, but her accent was so thick. Another time, Robin Wright, I revoiced her in State of Grace, not because they had any issues with Robin Wright, but because she wasn't around and they were going to put it on television, and back then they couldn't have any swearing. And one of my
Oh,
specialties was that I could match an actress's voice and I could make my voice sound like hers. So then you have a very specific parameters. You're just trying to make it, you have to make it work and you have to make it sound like the character and you have to match the lip flaps.
right.
So when the actress is saying, okay, you said I could swear on this show, right? So,
Absolutely.
and so you had to, back then, you couldn't do this on network television. So if the actor was saying, God, I'm actually really a little embarrassed to say this, but God fucking damn it. And you have to say, gosh darn it. And you have to make it work. It has to,
Wow.
otherwise, it's really. And back in the day, we would look and we go, that was a bad lip flap. we would watch these movies and we'd go, oh, or you could hear the other actor's voice come in going, they chose someone terrible. It was like a different person. But that was
Yeah.
my specialty, matching actors' voices. So I revoiced Gabrielle Anwar in
Okay.
The Scent of a Woman. Again, there were like little pieces. A lot of times when you go back and you clean up a track, you clean up the sound because the sound they just had a problem with background noise or something. And I think she was, I can't remember what the reason was now, but she was not available to do it. So I matched her voice and revoiced her. But most of the time, it's loop groups. It's a bunch of actors in a room, and what we're doing is we're revoicing all of the background actors who are just in the room, and we're coming up with dialogue. We're just making stuff up and
Right.
creating, yeah. So we're creating conversations that these actors in the background. So it's never just like blah, 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 blah. It's always a bunch of actors in a room, or it was back then, saying, having entire conversations that we made up, and then it's mixed way down in the track.
That's so fascinating. Honestly, because like I've been watching movies and shows and everything for so many years, and I never thought of revoicing even being a thing. Like I'm thinking about it now, and I'm thinking that has to be so difficult to do. And yeah, I mean, I'm so impressed, honestly, that you've had these revoicing roles, and
I
that
loved
that's
doing it. That was one
yeah,
of my favorite jobs. I did it for quite a few years when I was living in New York, and then when I moved to LA briefly. There are different loop groups in different places, and so I was just very fortunate because I loved that. I loved being in the studio. This
yeah,
big dark room where you had a gigantic version of the movie on the screen, usually in black and white, because they didn't need to use the full print. And then you
right.
would just stand there and they would hit the button and they'd say go, and you would hear beep, 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 three beeps, and then you would start and you would begin with their lip flap and they would match you. And you'd start when after the three beeps and you would say whatever line it was. And then they would decide whether it worked.
That is so cool.
It was fun.
I was thinking with your role as the sorceress, it made me think of your role in Monster. Was that your acting debut? Was that like your first show?
It wasn't my first one, it was my first guest starring. I had done a cable show. My first real show was a cable show called The National Comedy Test, I think, on Nickelodeon. And that was the
Oh,
first
okay.
time I had ever, my first major booking in a television show. And then Monsters was was great. Monsters was my first guest starring, and I loved it.
What did you like so much about that role?
Um, okay, so first of all, what was really, really exciting for me was that I beat out Carol Alt for that role. And
Really?
that was pretty, yeah, I did. Um, but it was a very, because she was dangerous. I like playing difficult people, and she was
Yeah,
dangerous. She was supposed to be so interesting and mysterious and beautiful. And she was, but she was dangerous. She was lethal. She just wanted to, she was uh, would go after Gabe, and she was ready to kill him. She was a vampire. So
right.
I just loved the game. That was a really wonderful little gem of a script. That was written by Alan Kingsburg, who is a wonderful writer and director. And he wrote this little game between the character Gabe and the character Natasha, where they were constantly trying to one up the other. And who was going to win, we didn't know. And in the end, we really thought it was Gabe who was going to lose, and he was the one who was going to be on the table with blood coming out of his neck.
Right.
And instead, it's Natasha. There's another instance where I was asked to scream as if, and I had to scream as if I had a pool cue, like stabbed through the heart.
That's so crazy that you have to go through those different types of ranges where they say like, yeah, you have to make this sound as if this is happening.
Yeah.
So there, as an actress, you have to put yourself into that scenario and then make it happen.
Yeah, you have to sort of figure out, okay, or if the pool cue is coming here, like this is where I feel it, and then your body collapses this way, and it's like, ugh, you know, but you're cut off because you're already almost dead from it happening. So yeah, it's fun.
After the roles that you had with Warcraft, did Blizzard ever ask you to do anything for like World of Warcraft and like maybe their other titles moving forward, or was that just it after that?
You know, I honestly, this is a terrible thing to say. I no longer remember. I did, from what I remember, I did like game after game after game. And then there was a point where I was working more as a musician than an actor because I was singing with Red and the Red Hots.
Right.
And I was just refocusing. And I don't remember. I mean, I really, it's like, I don't remember. But I thought I did 4 or 5 of them.
Yeah, because it has you credited up until Warcraft 3. And then I did notice on another page it said World of Warcraft, which I was thinking, like, wait a second, that one is after the third one. So I'm thinking, who did she voice in World of Warcraft? Like, I was trying to piece it all together. But I do
Because I
understand
think
too.
that was
It's
the
been some time.
expander. That's when I did it was like that's because it was after 3 that I did an expander. The last one I did was an
Yeah.
expander edition, I think.
So they had the original Warcraft 3 and then the expansion to that was called Warcraft 3 The Frozen Throne. So that was the one. And then after
Oh.
that they did a totally different type of game called World of Warcraft, and then that's still going on today.
Okay.
Um
And I haven't done them in decades.
in so long. Yeah, yeah, it's
Yeah.
been a while.
And I
And
think they like to have new voices coming in and out. It's really, really important,
yeah.
particularly if, and I never really understood this, that you would hear my voice over and over again. That means you get to know it really well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So, yeah,
And there's like little things too. If you keep clicking on the unit,
yeah.
you'll hear lines that you don't typically hear. So
Really?
there's like little secrets there, so you'll hear more lines that they, had you record, and if they hadn't done that, like just clicking, 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 they wouldn't have ever heard it. So it was like a little secret thing there,
Is
you
that
know.
what's called an Easter egg?
That's exactly it. I love talking about that. I love talking about Easter eggs in film, in games, and in everything because it's so cool that the people behind the scenes just insert these little details here and there, and then you discover them either when it just comes out or years later.
Yeah.
You know, um, I like that creative aspect of it. That they just put these things here and there, but
And I
yeah, it's
probably
funny
live those
because
games.
when you worked with Blizzard,
Hmm.
they were a vastly different company than who they are now. Now they are gigantic.
That's right.
Uh,
They
yeah,
were
and
an
they've
upstart company in a building, and they had one big room where things were being coded and such, and a few offices. That was it. And
yeah.
we recorded in a really simple recording booth. And I'm not sure who the guy was that was like directing me. I got the feeling it was like a guy who was like, "Oh man, seriously, I'm busy coding. You want me to talk to her?"
Oh my gosh!
I mean, I feel
Wow.
like it was really bootleg.
Yeah, yeah.
And then as
Maybe
they
they.
expanded.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, maybe they just were probably trying to meet deadlines and were super stressed. I imagine.
But that's what I mean. I mean, I don't think they had a whole unit working on that. They were just
Yeah.
like everybody did everything. I was my impression back then.
Yeah, and I feel like video game companies at that time were very much like that
They were.
because it was still a medium that was growing,
Mm-hmm.
and they probably had to, like you're saying, have guys that were programming and bringing in people for the voice acting, doing all sorts of jobs.
That's right. I'm
And
trying to remember what the other like there were a few games that I worked on, but they
was
were
it Heretic 2 was the other one?
Heretic. Yes, thank you.
Yes. That was the
Thank
one.
you.
Yeah. Now, I never played that one, but I imagine it was probably, if I were to guess, it would be similar to these other role-playing type of games where they really focus on the characters and the story and everything.
They did. This one, as I said, this was very different from the way they did World of Warcraft. This one was they had a very complete, they absolutely knew what the character was. They had already created the character who was just basically like a globe of light or something. I mean, they even knew what color light. And they were very specific about how they wanted this character to be and the kind of smoothness of tone and lift and some, a creature that was both a caretaker and magical
Exactly.
and powerful.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why they had such a strong direction for you for that character. They really wanted it a certain way, it seemed like.
Yeah.
So now, Rebecca, I do not want to neglect your other amazing creative side, and that is your talented singing ability. And you come from a family of singers. Is that correct?
I do. How do you know that, though?
Well, in the research I was doing, I saw in an interview that you had mentioned that you do come from a family of creatives in singing, and
Hmm.
when I saw that, I was like, oh, that's great. That must have been her big inspiration for getting into singing or even acting.
My parents were interesting people. Are, I should say. Well, my father has passed, but my mother's still alive. And they were very creative, as you just said. They were and loved music. Music was very important. So I grew up in a family where we had, music lessons were important. We had a piano. My older sister, was an incredible pianist, and she entered, oddly enough, she went to Harvard and she entered as a music major, which is really weird. She exited as an historian, but she entered as a music major.
Oh
And then
wow.
my other sister uh, was a song and is a song and dance girl, not so much now. And so she toured the country, understudying Marie Osmond and Sound of Music. And she's a coloratura, beautiful voice. And my brother, he didn't, my sister and I made it somewhat our career. My brother, not so, but he was, he loves to write and plays the piano, plays the guitar. He's got a gorgeous voice. So everybody sings, plays the piano. We used to fight a lot over who was going to sing what part. Like if we sang at Christmas, and we'd fight
Yeah.
over who was going to play the piano. Like but when we got through that, we'd finally manage to sing a carol or two as a family. My dad was an Irish tenor. He
Oh
was a
wow.
lawyer, but he was an Irish tenor, a gorgeous voice.
Amazing. I imagine the family Christmases must have been insane with like that. It's just so much singing talent.
We all sang and we were all loud.
Yeah. That's great. Now, there was something else too that I needed to clear up in my research. I had some sources saying you were born in Atlanta, Georgia, and then others saying you were born in Boston. But now I want to favor on the side of that you were born in Boston. Is that correct?
And you're right. Yes, I was. I don't know how that, sometimes information just ends up being wrong. Yeah, I was born in Boston. I grew up in Boston. I went to college and graduate school in Boston. And I left finally to move to New York. But my parents moved to Atlanta when I was a sophomore in college. And
Oh, I
so
see.
that's how the Atlanta connection came in. And I'm in Atlanta now. I chose to come here when COVID happened because I wanted to kind of keep an eye on my mom.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because I live in around to go to Atlanta, but I always hear good things about it. And one of these days I want to make my way over there.
Well, it's hilariously ironic that I moved here during COVID. So I basically I haven't met anyone. I haven't gotten around. I've been in lockdown for 2 years.
Right.
So, but Atlanta is fun. It's got a thriving film community, which I'm
Yeah.
extremely curious about. And an acting community. I have lots of restaurants, things to do. It's growing by leaps and bounds, and I love seeing as the new neighborhoods start to, to develop, and it gets more and more interesting because Atlanta's so New England is old, and we sort of, everything is, and it's farmland and stuff like that. Not so much now, but when I was a kid, you could drive out and you drive this way and you were on the ocean, you drive this way or in farmland. And in Atlanta, you just have extensive little towns all around on the
Yeah.
outskirts, and they're quite beautiful and very southern.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And
So,
I haven't made my way over to Boston, but
mhm,
I've always wanted to go because you do get that historical vibe from it.
you do.
And I've heard that everything is just very like compact there, like all like the
It is
roads and everything. And but yeah,
narrow
one of these
streets.
days I definitely want to go.
Narrow streets, and all of the streets in Boston were based on cowpaths. So that means they're one way in all these crazy directions. It's really complicated trying to drive around. You're much better just taking the subway in Boston and walking. And
Yeah,
it's compact
yeah,
enough that you can do it and you'll get someplace, and it's really pretty. Whereas in Atlanta are all these cool neighborhoods, but they're only beginning to link them now with the Beltline, which is wonderful. But prior to that, you really have to drive from area to area. In Boston, yes, and this, of course, in the suburbs you do, but in Boston proper, you can just walk. I used to ride my
yeah.
bike everywhere there.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Yeah.
dangerous.
Oh, dangerous, but yeah, probably the most convenient. It seems like
It
from how
was.
you're describing it. Yeah.
I did a gig. Again, I love playing difficult characters. So I was doing a really interesting show in Boston called Talking With, and I played a psycho baton twirler. And I used to ride my bike. I was learning how to twirl. So I had these two batons that I had crisscrossed on my backpack, and I would ride around Boston with these batons on my backpack, going, to rehearsal or from or something. That's my memory of
That's so
riding around
funny.
in Boston.
And what was I going to say too? So you had started your own music agency
Yes,
called Rossi Music Inc.
I did.
And what I loved about this when I was reading it was that it said that you had mentored young musicians.
Yeah, that was kind of a
What was
wonderful
that
thing
like?
to do. When I was married at the time, and my ex-husband and I started it because uh, we wanted to have more artistic control over the groups that we were working with. And I had a lot of things that I wanted to start. Like there was things I wanted to do, and I ended up doing a kind of an international group where I was singing in French and Italian and Spanish, and that was something I badly wanted to do. So having an agency allowed me to create groups, and it put me in contact with a lot of great musicians. My ex husband was a very talented saxophone player, and he knew a lot of great guys. So that was just a wonderful opportunity. But mentoring musicians, we started having interns, and we weren't fans of the idea of just like having people train or work for us for free. That just seemed creepy. So
Right.
what we did is we would interview people, and we would say to them, this is what we can pay you, but this is what we're going to do for you. And we're going to teach you how to work in this niche industry, which is corporate events. And we would train them on all of the things that young musicians, they would learn music at school, but they had to learn the basics. They had to learn how to show up on time. They had to learn
Yeah.
how to dress. They had to learn what kind of music they needed. We helped a couple of our guys. We had several musicians. At one point, we had them form a band, and then we formed another band out of another group of our interns, and they were wonderful. And then we were booking them, and they were terrific musicians, and these were great bands. And we helped them with their charts. We helped them with the repertoire. We helped them with look. And then they kind of took over because they were young, creative, cool musicians. And so a couple of those bands, I'm no longer with Rossi Music, but those bands still exist. And Jimmy's out booking all the time. It makes me so happy for him. Actually, we had the two Jimmys. The two Jimmys are still booking.
That's so great, like for young musicians to have those resources. as they start to advance in their careers, they need to know the other little things, like arriving to places on time, or you
Yeah.
know and having that sort of aspect of it is got to be equally as important.
It's so unsexy to say, well, you have to learn how to show up. But gigs are about, this is a very, as I say, this is a very specific niche in the business, corporate events, but they are very corporate. Corporate events, private parties, weddings, but they pay well. But this means you have clients that are expecting a certain kind of music, certain artists, and they want it done well. They want it done just
Right.
like the artist. And showing up on time, I learned, and I had kind of learned this the hard way too. Showing up on time is 80% of the gig, I swear. And yet it was really important to have a really high quality band and great singers and great musicians were really flexible and who could play anything. But you had to be there because they needed you to be there at this time because there's so many moving parts at events. And you're
Right.
dealing with layers of people. You're dealing with event planners and you're dealing with brides and grooms. And for them, they don't need any more stress on this day. You need to show up and take the stress off their shoulders. And you need to
Exactly.
show up and you are running it. You are usually, when you're the musician, you're running an event. The timeline is in your hands. And if you don't run it properly, things fall apart. So, for example, if you announce the bouquet toss and the bride has left the room, you got a small problem. And
Yeah.
if you, so these are they seem so obvious, but they're not. They're really detailed, challenging events, and the musicians take on a lot of responsibility. So we trained them.
Now, did you have a mentor when you were building your music career?
My music career went in so many directions because I studied opera. And then when in New York, I ended up creating with a couple of other singers. It was not my band. I auditioned for it, but it was like an Andrews Sisters act. So I kept on kind of falling into things. And I worked with the Satin Dolls for several years and it was really fun and I learned a lot. And that's where I really learned that I loved part singing. That was probably one of my favorite things. And
Yeah.
then again, when I moved to LA, singing was always how I made money. It wasn't a career for me. It was just how I made money. And I was just trying so hard to make it as an actor. And I ended up just doing this mishmash of a career where I ended up doing a lot of commercials and doing some really terrible movies and doing some voiceover and doing it was just I just did whatever I could. I was super flexible. But I would say after all that, I would say that in a way, I ended up working with a group called Red and the Red Hots, which was an amazing group. And Red Young was a mentor in that way. Red he created that group and went through several iterations because his singers were so good. Cassie Miller and Dina Bennett, they were so talented, and Jennifer Griffin, that they were frequently off doing other things. So Cassie Miller was working with Bill Elliott when she wasn't working with, and these were all really great groups. And Red himself was working with Big Bad Voodoo Daddy and with Royal Crown Review or with pieces of these groups. So everybody was always work. So then he would have to re-put the band together to show up for this event. So that's how I got involved. And I was a certain iteration and I learned everything. No, that's okay. Listen, we all know what it's like being online 100% of the time.
Yeah, remote podcasting is definitely it's a learning process, but yeah,
I
we're
know.
making it work.
I teach remotely. I mean, that's how I prefer teaching in person. I love teaching voice. It really, but I do it all remotely because it's so COVID intensive singing.
Is there any differences between like teaching it remotely versus in person, would you say?
Um Yeah, because when you're teaching remotely, you're dealing with this thing called latency. There's just a little bit of lag. So, but I started teaching online prior to COVID, so I'm really used to it. I'm used to my ears accustomed to hearing the singer that I'm working with a nanosecond or two behind what I'm playing.
Yeah.
But I always like being in the room because there's just more detail and nuance. So I will be really, really happy when we're able to be in the room all together again. And there's also an energy that you get when you work with a person, all artists and everyone.
Right.
Remote work is fine, but we all like being in the room with each other. It's social. We're social creatures.
you toured in this country as well as Europe.
I
Is that
did.
correct?
I did.
What was it like touring in Europe?
Touring in Europe, what I mostly did in Europe was I was working in London and working in Spain. And that was me on my own. Did I go to Europe with the Red Hots? No. That was me on my own singing in different jazz clubs. And that was really, really fun. And I loved it. And I'm really lucky because I've gone to Europe at different times in my life just for fun. But whenever I could get a job abroad, I was there. So
Yeah,
that sometimes I would be in Europe and then I would end up being able to stay in Europe because I managed to book something. And so it
right.
was a little bit, it wasn't like I did not have a road manager. I did not have somebody making bookings for me ahead of time. But I did somehow always manage to stand up in a club and then get myself a gig. And the gig would, I had a long running gig in a hotel that no longer exists, actually. It's called the Hotel Penta in London. And I was there for almost a year.
Wow.
That was really fun. I love that. That was a jazz gig.
And you can sing in 5 different languages?
Yes, well, I do include English as one of those languages. But yes, I sing in French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and English. I'd say that, and French is a pretty good language for me, and Spanish pretty good. My Italian, I'm working really hard on now because I love Italian. It's a beautiful language to sing in, and so I want to get better with it. And besides, I have a sister that lives in Italy, and so I go to visit her a lot. So I'm working on my Italian. As singing in a language is one experience. Speaking a language is another.
Yeah.
And I like to have them meshed, but Italian is one of my favorite languages to sing in. Italian and French are my two faves.
Because I guess singing in a language versus speaking it, it's like you have everything sort of written out and you know what you're going to say essentially through song versus speaking it's just like a whole different animal, you know.
Speaking is a different animal. Singing a language, you do have to understand the language because to it's impossible to memorize music, words that you don't understand. That'd be like memorizing random syllables, and your brain can only do so much of that.
Right.
So you have to be connected through the meaning of it. But the challenge with singing in a language is that you're doing two things. When I speak a language, I want the language to be I want it to be a great accent. So, quand je parle français, il faut que je parle avec un certain mot. My voice has to be placed in a certain place. But when I'm
Yeah.
singing in a language, I'm placing my voice a little differently because now I'm placing it as a singer. So you're working with the intersection of placing your voice as a singer and placing it in the language, which is probably a little boring as I describe it, but that's what I'm doing.
No, it's so fascinating because then I also draw parallels to the process for voice acting and preparing
Mm-hmm.
for those roles because it's like you really need to nail down all these nuances with voice with your voice pretty much, you
Yeah.
know, whether that's in another language or whether that's for a specific voice role. So I think that's great.
That's true. When you're working on a character, it does help to figure out where a voice lives in that character.
Yeah.
Sometimes we have a voice that's really low and the voice is down here. And sometimes we kind of want it a little bit nasal and a little irritating. And sometimes it's got to be a little hopeful and it's a little breathy. And so it's a little like anxious. You sort of, and then you refine it and you mix these little bits and pieces together. But yes, a voice lives in a certain place.
And you literally just demonstrated range right there. That's what's so amazing with voice actors is the range is being able to play all these different characters as just one person.
I think the actors that really amaze me, because I am not particularly, I've done animation, but I'm not an animation voice actor. Like, I know doing it, like, they do crazy voices. And
Yeah.
I am so respectful of people that have that kind of fluidity and they take those chances with their voice. Me, I'm always a little bit worried I have to protect my singing voice. So I'm like, I'm
Yeah.
going to go this far and no farther, you know?
When I
So,
would see the behind the scenes of some of these voice actors for cartoons, like the
oh my
one like Tom Kenny who does SpongeBob, like he has to physically grab his throat in a certain way
God.
to
Hmm.
get that high pitched sound of his character. And it's just so incredible. You gotta appreciate the talent there.
Yeah, the talent and the dedication. These are
Yeah.
people, and they figured it out. I mean, it's talent. It's amazing, but it's also he figured out how to do that. He figured out that he could take his voice and grab it that way and get that sound, and that's playful like a kid. Because when you listen
Yeah.
to kids, kids do that stuff. They're always that's it's actually one of the challenges sometimes with children is you'll say something to them and then they'll say it to you 20 different ways until you want to like you're just like stop.
Yeah.
And
Kids,
voice
I guess
actors
you
are
could
like
say,
that.
are some of the best voice actors out there. They got all sorts of range.
Exactly.
um, Rebecca, I wanted to congratulate you on your nomination for your role in 33 Variations. And that, to me, when I was reading that role, is just so, it was so incredible what you had to do for that role. Can you describe what it was like uh, playing a character who has ALS?
um that role is one of those bucket list roles. Okay, it is such a it the you have the drama of this character who she is as a person was difficult. She was a difficult woman. She was a hard woman to have as a mother. And a lot of the interaction of this character is with her daughter, who is very angry with her because she was not a great mom, because she was so um, focused on her career. And
Right.
now, after years and years of focus on her career to the exclusion of everybody else in her life, now she has ALS. And so she has this strong will, but her body is betraying her. So what I did was I would go online and I would find these people who had ALS, who had podcasts and blogs and such, vlogs, and they would podcast about what they were going through, and they would uh, you could see the change in them. Like I would go early into a podcast, some of these people had already died and I didn't really know it, and I would go
Oh,
early into
wow.
their podcasts and I'd be listening to them, and you like them. These are people who are facing something you could never imagine, and then suddenly you come to an end and you realize they died,
Oh, my
and
goodness.
it gets harder and harder. So what I did was, I'm sorry, these are people that had such strength and such courage, and I will not ever forget what people in this world face that I have no idea. In my life has been an easy life. And these people, so what I would do is I would choose something. I would choose my tongue getting heavy in my mouth. And then I would have trouble with the talking. And then I would have to work around it. And that would be, so I would choose something. I would choose my arm or my hand first. And I would make specific decisions for each scene as to what I was working with. And it would probably, and I would extend it. And then it slowly would grow into my body. In each scene, it would be something more. And I was working with my body and with my face and my ability to talk. The challenge was always that you're working with talking, and you can't make it too hard for the audience to understand you. And
Right.
so I would walk this very fine line, and I would try to have the difficulty almost between the lines. So that's what I did. I would work with her rage and her fear, and I would work with the specific, because I can't imagine not having rage over something like this. Although
Right.
when you listen to someone like Stephen Hawking, and he would say, in my body, I am imprisoned, but in my mind, I am free. And
Yeah.
he was more free than, and than anyone. His mind was just took him everywhere and took us with him. So I would work with her rage and I would work with her fear and try to do it piece by piece.
I find the level of preparation that that role needed is just so admirable that you took the time to research it, to look into all of these things how as to accurately portray someone with ALS. And that's not an easy role, especially in front of a live audience, no less.
But I can't imagine. My biggest fear would be getting in front of a live audience and doing a terrible job. Getting in front of a live audience and making a mockery of something like that by not knowing
Right.
it. And what I did not expect was, you know, uh, more than one person coming up to me, more than one, not a lot, but just a couple of people who said, my daughter had died of ALS. And watching you do this, and they'd be crying, and they weren't crying because it was a brilliant performance. They were crying over the loss of their child or their
Right.
niece or whatever. They were that's But thank God I didn't do it wrong. Thank God I
Yeah.
didn't. At least, I might not have gotten it all, but I got a piece of it, and I got a piece of it right. Because who knew that there was going to be somebody in that audience who had watched it happen to someone they love?
Sure. Yeah. And I imagine it would have been easier if it were for a film, because in that sense, you'd have a do over, or you'd have these multiple opportunities scene by scene to be able to portray it the right way. It's just amazing that in front of a live audience, it's like there's no errors there. You have to do it as best as you can. And no, I just find it so admirable. I think that was a great role.
I was going to say the thing about film, and there are do overs, and it does seem like it would be easier, but in a way, film is difficult because, or in a way, I should say, more difficult in certain ways because it's out of order. And when you're doing it and I had forgotten because I had done a lot of stage work when I was in Boston. And then I started doing film and television and I got accustomed to it. But I remember at the beginning, I found it really disconcerting because I didn't do it in order. And that's hard. It's hard to remember where you are if you're shooting out of order. It's like, where are you with your body? Where are you emotionally? So I actually found the fact that I was doing it in order night after night after night, where it had a beginning, a middle, and end. I found that that was okay. That worked for me.
Yeah, yeah. And it's funny because I had Jeff Steitzer on the show, who's directed several plays. He's even acted in plays, and he's a voice actor as well. And I asked him if he ever had any moments of stage fright. And I'm also going to ask you, did you ever have that? Any sort of nerves or stage fright in any of your stage acting roles?
Well, of course, when I began, I used to be so scared. I remember the first time I ever had a singing job or like I sang at church or something, and I literally shook so much. My body shook visibly. And I had
Yeah.
to like I had to stand up. I was in the congregation and I stood up and I'm shaking and I finally started walking. I like left the pew and started walking down the aisle because I was shaking and it was embarrassing and I couldn't stop. Yeah, I used to get really scared. I think that what happens is that you get used to doing it. The more you perform and the more you audition too, because going in to audition for anything, is really nerve wracking. And every time you go into the room, you're in front of different people and you're in front of a larger and larger group. First time you're just, auditioning for the casting director. Then you're auditioning for maybe the director. And then all of a sudden you got a room full of people. It's the costume and it's makeup and it's, and they're all in there looking at you, trying to decide whether you're still correct. Now they've got you working with a family or whatever. So
Yeah.
I used to get really scared, but I got used to auditioning, and that really helped me. And every time you do something new, you find your nerves again. And actually, when I was
Right.
doing that character, one night I did like that is a very, by the way, she has these huge monologues, tons of huge monologues. And so I used to really worry that I was going to forget something. And there was one night where I'm standing there and I say the line and I go blank. And I just held for a second and I kind of like had to focus, and then you jump back in again. But there was like a stab of fear.
Oh man, I can imagine just to have those like blank moments where you're like, okay, what's the line? What's the line? It's like that would be so terrifying. Oh my goodness.
But that's where you
Um,
just really rely on practicing, practicing, practicing. Because you do it, and this is what I say to my students too. I was like, you have to practice the words, you have to practice taking a breath. Like you have to make it so automatic that you don't think. It has to be like breathing,
yeah,
because your mind might be screaming, get me out of here, oh my god, particularly when you're walking into an audition. So you have to have it so down that you can do it standing on your head, do it in your sleep.
and imagine walking into an audition and there's like someone really famous that you know that's in the cast just sitting there watching you. That's got to be tough as well. In addition to the director and everybody else, but
That would be the bar
oh
you're
man,
being held to, but usually
yeah,
they're not there.
that's a good thing. Yeah,
Yeah.
because to have someone that you admire watching you, I mean, that's got to add so much intensity to the situation. But
I was working with, this is not me, but a girl I was in class with who is very, very talented. And she had her own series for a while. And I actually just saw her in Barry. She's so talented. And anyway, she described a time where she went for an audition. She was going in for producers. And right before she walked in, I think the casting director came up to her and said, "Hey, we're having a problem negotiating with your negotiations, and we're having a problem with your agent." And she said to us later, she's like, "I had to let that go. I couldn't. I couldn't believe that they said this to me." And I couldn't right before I walked into the room, but I had to breathe and let it go. And that's focus. That
yeah,
is focus. That is being a pro, because that's hard to do.
yeah, being able to stay in the pocket in a situation like that,
Yeah.
that's not an easy thing to do at all.
Yeah. Practice is training your mind. It's not just memorizing and stuff like that. It's because you're training your mind to stay there
Exactly.
no matter what.
Well, Rebecca, we just hit our time. And thank you so much for coming on to the show. I really appreciate it. And if you have anything to plug or promote, anything you got going on, let me know.
No, I just, you know what? Things are quiet right now because of COVID. So I'm just teaching. I teach voiceover and I teach singing, and quite enjoy it, you know.
Well,
But
there
this
you
was
go.
so much fun. And I have to say, I'm so impressed with all the things you know about me. That's crazy. Really surprising. You really did your homework. And thank you. Thank you for inviting me here to do this.
Of course, anytime. You're welcome back anytime onto the show. And I want to thank all the listeners and viewers for watching this episode. And don't forget to rate and review the show. And we will see you in the next one. Bye bye now.